All right, we're going to get started. So hi, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Grace Collars. I'm an AmeriCorps member at Conservation Nebraska. I'll be your host for tonight's evening, and my fellow AmeriCorps member, Madison. She did the planning for tonight, so I'll be here for more of the technology side of things. I would like to start off reminding everyone your cameras are turned off and you're automatically muted. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can drop them in the chat or the Q&A function. There will be a poll sent out at the end of the presentation. If you complete it, your name will be entered to win a $25 gift card. So we were
Nice.
completing it. Yeah, exactly. So Madison will start introducing the speakers for tonight, and yeah, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks. Like Grace said, my name is Madison Snodgrass. I'm also with AmeriCorps, Conservation Nebraska. Thanks so much for coming here tonight. We're learning about the value of native trees and shrubs with speaker Justin Evertson. He is the Green Infrastructure Coordinator for the Nebraska Forest Service and the Statewide Arboretum. He's been with them since the 1990s. So yeah, he has a lot, he knows a lot. So just take it away, Justin.
All right, Madison, does it look like I'm old enough to be there since 1990?
I'm not sucking up or anything, but no.
All right, woo. Because I sure feel that old on a lot of days. Well, hey, Madison, thanks a lot for inviting me. You too, Grace. I'm happy to be here today. I love talking about trees, and the day before Arbor Day, this I think is a great topic. I love what you're trying to do with the organization there. We do need to think about trees and how they fit within the broader environment of Nebraska. They definitely have a place in the landscape, and we're going to talk about that. And we're going to focus in more on maybe thinking about utilizing regionally native trees in our landscapes. You know, there's so many we can choose from. There's a lot of good trees that are not native, but why would we want to push natives? We're going to talk about that a little bit. Yeah, I've been with the Statewide Arboretum and the Forest Service since 1990, a lot of years here, and I've been really fortunate to be able to work with trees that whole way along. And then another thing I do is I started an arboretum out in Waverly where I live. And since about 1995, I've been helping to plant trees in our city parks and in our schools. And that has given me a real hands-on experience with trees and helped me learn probably more than anything I probably could have done. And I have a hat on. I normally wouldn't want to wear a hat in front of all of you, but I was outside all afternoon actually cutting back native grasses. I'm smelly and I have hat hair, so I'll leave my hat on. But that's kind of the challenge of what we have in Nebraska, right? We a lot going on in spring. So it's a pleasure to be here. Maybe before we get into the talking about tree selection, let's think just quickly about a reminder about the value of trees. I was cutting back grasses, native grasses this afternoon. We're in a prairie state, and of course our prairie grasses and other landscape elements are hugely important, but trees are definitely special in terms of the work they do in our environment and for us. I'm a green infrastructure coordinator, and we think of trees as green infrastructure, that kind of infrastructure of the community that is green and growing in the backdrop of our lives. I won't belabor the point, but planting a tree is one of the most important things anybody can do to give back to their community and to the environment. Trees do so much good. There are problems with trees at times. They fall apart in storms. They maybe cost a little to plant and maintain, but overall they return way more on that investment over time than anything that we would pay out of our pockets. So we got to talk people into planting more trees. The value in terms of energy conservation, shade in the summer, stormwater capture, wildlife, property values. One tree can have the value of thousands of dollars over its lifetime. So let's remember that. But even beyond dollar values, wow, trees are just so incredibly beautiful, fun to be around. It's fun to watch them grow. They sustain birds and wildlife of all kinds. If we didn't have trees in the backdrop of our existence in our communities, we'd really feel it here in Nebraska. So let's remember to plant trees, and I think this is a perfect topic for that. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully I find the right thing to share here. Screen 2. Okay, share. Can everybody see that? Is that okay, Madison? All right, thank you, Madison. Yeah, we're going to hone in on native trees and shrubs. And maybe one more before we get started on this. This year is already hot and dry, and we went into spring dry. It's not looking real good for a lot of moisture coming our way. The state is literally burning in some places because of our dry early spring. So it's going to be hard on trees. We should plant trees, but maybe this spring, put extra effort into managing and watering those trees that we've recently planted. And I don't want to say don't plant trees, but if you plant trees this year, boy, put extra time and attention into making sure they're watered this year, because it could kill them in a hurry the way we're headed. So normally we don't have to worry a whole lot about that here in eastern Nebraska. I've planted hundreds, if not thousands of trees in my lifetime. And when I plant them in the fall, I almost never have to water again the next spring, other than maybe once or twice. Well, this is one of those years every 5-10 years we get that we have to water a lot. So let's just be aware of that. Okay, a few words of wisdom. What are the 3 hardest things to say? I was wrong. I'm sorry. Those things are very hard for me at times. You can ask my wife. And I'm wrong pretty often. So, and then finally, this word here, Worcestershire sauce. I still don't think I pronounced that properly, but that's one of the 3 hardest things to say. So when we're talking trees, let's have fun with this. We can definitely have room for humor, and trees help bring joy to our lives, and hopefully we're smiling while we do it. Okay, Arbor Day, officially tomorrow in Nebraska, Friday, the last Friday in April every year. And J. Sterling Morton was considered the founder of Arbor Day, going back 150 years ago to 1872 was the first official Arbor Day. Here you see a picture on the right, President Hoover planting a tree at the White House for Arbor Day in 1931. And that was 1 year in front of the 50th anniversary of Arbor Day. So I don't think J. Sterling was around for that one. He was mostly an adult in the late 1800s. And here's kind of a pretty common quote from J. Sterling about Arbor Day. Other holidays repose upon the past. Arbor Day proposes for the future. I thought that was, always a really good quote to have handy. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about primarily regionally native trees when we think about what we can grow. But just be aware that even here in Nebraska, a prairie state with very few trees naturally occurring, we can coax 200 to 250 types of trees to grow in this state. So that's a really nice box of crayons to work from, right? That we can pull out and plant. So when we got that many trees to think about, what are we going to pick and plant? Well, one of the best things we can start thinking about is planting more of our native trees. And when we think about native trees in this broader context of native plants, here's just some of the values we think about. They improve greater biodiversity. They add biodiversity not only for the beings that they are, the plants that they are, but what they help sustain. One bur oak tree, for example, will sustain thousands and thousands of insects in a year or in a week, hundreds of species, let alone birds and tree frogs and mammals and all kinds of other things. Multiply by that by thousands of other trees. Wow, that really starts to paint a picture for biodiversity. Climate resilience. All of our trees that are naturally here on the Great Plains, boy, are they climate resilient. We don't think about it, but most of our trees are genetically adapted from ice ages, pushing them around for thousands of years. And at the retreat of the last ice age, it left behind all the trees we have here natively in our region. Those trees are tough as nails for drought, for wet, for heat, for cold. So that's a big reason why we think native trees. Invasiveness is generally not a major concern for our native plants. The one exception in the tree sense is probably red cedar, our only native evergreen to eastern Nebraska. It definitely deserves its place in our landscape, but it is also running amok on our native prairies and grasslands. And so we got to be careful. And then beauty, boy, our native plants are beautiful, especially when we see them in the proper light. Now, I don't want to pick on J. Sterling Morton too hard here, but J. Sterling had a great idea about Arbor Day. But beyond that, he was kind of a cantankerous old fart and maybe a little backward in his thinking. We're not going to get into justice, social justice or politics, but he had really poor thoughts about his fellow humans, especially non-white people. That we'll save that for another day. But here's what he said about the prairie of Nebraska when they came here. Imagine that when he arrived in 1854, the land was unbroken. I would have loved to seen those rolling tall grass prairies because they're all gone now. And here's what he said: everywhere these rich and rolling prairies, which had lain for unnumbered centuries as blank leaves in the history of the world's progress, were being written upon the land upon by the hand of toil, snatched from the obscurity of uselessness, and forever dedicated to the support of the Anglo-Saxon race. The sunshine seemed brighter and the rains and the dews more beautiful and refreshing because that they descended upon the earth and found it not all a wild and desolate waste. He's talking about converting prairie to farm ground. And certainly we should be proud of our rich farm ground in Nebraska that helps feed the world based on the soils produced over thousands of years by our prairies. So come on, people, grow prairie too, but we're here to talk about trees. And there's limitations of native plants for landscaping. Let's be honest about that, especially with our native trees. In the urban and built areas, the native soils are gone, so it makes it hard to use native plants. Many species require special siting conditions. There are few native evergreens. Nursery availability is limited. Some native plants are problematic or aggressive. Roughleaf dogwood is a tough one for us here in eastern Nebraska. A lack of aesthetic acceptance by the public, and it's hard to mimic the natural disturbances that prairie plants thrive on. Finally, management. People know how to mow the lawn, but managing native landscapes is more complicated. So, yes, we need to plant more native plants, but it's not just as simple as recreating the prairie in our backyards and our parks. There's a middle ground out there. Let's dive into this real quickly. The value of landscape biodiversity and emphasizing native plants. Also, let me quickly ask a question. Madison or Grace, if you're listening, I hope you're recording the program. I told people that that might be available as a recording that we could send a link out.
Yes.
All right.
We'll be recorded and edit it and put it on our YouTube.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll get a link for that later on. Okay, how's that for a bad interruption? Thanks, guys. Okay, the value of landscape biodiversity, emphasizing natives. We're not going to dive into this too hard, but we get greater diversity of wildlife. We talked about that. More pollinators and better pollination. More predatory insects. And so you get a better insect balance out there. So the bad insects that are chewing things you don't like to be chewing on, we have more predatory insects beating them back and fewer pest outbreaks. We end up with better, healthier soils, more stormwater absorption, and greater resiliency to weather events, insects, and diseases. When it comes to trees and shrubs, one of the best minds in this regard in North America for the value of natives is Doug Tallamy. He's written a lot of books in this regard. I've read all of these over the years. I highly recommend them. This one, The Nature of Oaks, is a fun read about one tree, a white oak in his yard, and watching it sustain the world around itself for over 12 months. It was fun to read. So pick up a Doug Tallamy book. And he talks about just the insect support that our native trees provide, even in just Lepidoptera. Butterflies and moths. I mentioned the oak earlier. The oak sustains 517 species of Lepidoptera and moth. So at any one time, it's probably thousands and thousands of insects on a tree. And then you'll look down here, these are all native species underneath it. You get down to the bottom, and here's a tree that gets planted probably more than any other tree in North America, especially in ornamental, and that's the calorie pear tree. It's from China, and nothing eats it, nothing eats it. And that's why people love it, because it's got clean foliage. It's quite a graceful, pretty tree, but it does nothing to sustain our birds, insects, and wildlife. So no more ornamental pear. Native plants bring all these insects. Wow, it's just a plethora of biodiversity going on out there. And those insects feed a wide variety of birds, native birds. These are just a few of the birds I've seen in my backyard already this spring. That we're waking up and getting all kinds of bird activity. I should say, I did not take those pictures. So I cannot take a good bird picture, but I had them sent to me and they're wonderful bird pictures. So what's native? What I would suggest we think about is think regionally native. Remember what I said earlier, our trees and shrubs here in Nebraska got pushed in and out of our region by the ice ages, advancements and retreats. And so really we need to think regionally, Great Plains and Midwest native, because some of those trees were probably here in great abundance now, even though they're not here now. A good example would be white oak. It barely exists in southeast Nebraska, but it was here in great abundance at one time. And then believe it or not, the white spruce up here native into the Black Hills of South Dakota, it actually used to cover much of the sand hills when the last ice age reached its southern limits. So it was also an important native tree at one time. But let's think regionally, because there's regional adaptability to these species when we utilize them in our landscapes. Another interesting thing about Nebraska is it sits at an ecological crossroads, especially for woody species. There are 35 tree species which reach their geographic range limit here in Nebraska, more than any other state. And this is primarily trees that reach their western limit, moving west across the eastern United States. You can think of the eastern US as primarily a forested environment. There are pockets of prairie, but until you get to Iowa and then Nebraska, Minnesota, Missouri, there wasn't a whole lot of prairie. Well, all those woody plants reach their western zenith, kind of in Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, and Kansas. We should be proud of that. There's a lot of species to draw from. And then a few species reach their eastern limit in western Nebraska. So things like ponderosa pine, limber pine, Rocky Mountain juniper, Rocky Mountain maple, water birch is actually a very wonderful ornamental tree for western Nebraska, etc. All right, so I've talked now for several minutes and we haven't even gotten into the meat of this. So I'm going to fly through some trees to throw at you, regionally native species that I think we should plant more of. I don't want to belabor the point. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but ask questions in the chat if you have any questions specifically. One of the first I'll actually throw out at you. People love their maple trees. They do. You get a lawn established and then people want a red maple. And a red maple is not a bad tree, but it's overplanted in eastern Nebraska, not nearly the long-lived species that a sugar maple would be. And if you're careful about the seed source of your sugar maple, you'll get a maple that's actually quite drought adapted and climate adapted if we do it right. So Caddo variety of sugar maple from Oklahoma is a good one for southern and eastern Nebraska. It's probably going to tolerate our changing climate, heat, more drought and more heat. And then in western Nebraska, the big tooth maple or sometimes called the canyon maple from Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, that's a western cousin of the sugar maple. And it's more of an ornamental tree, multi-stem tree, but we should plant more of it in western Nebraska. One of my favorite trees for the landscape underplanted is the bitternut hickory. It's one of our 2 native hickories to southeast Nebraska, and it's going to be a great alternative to the green ash trees that we're going to lose from emerald ash borer. Good fall color. From a distance, you cannot tell it apart from a green ash, except that it's going to be here a lot longer. Feeds a lot of wildlife. Pecan, the northern pecan is one of my favorite trees. Here's a picture of one I planted in Waverly, already 30 to 40 feet tall. A big old one out in Kearney. The pecan tree has proven itself to be so readily adaptable across the Midwest and the Central Great Plains. We should plant more of it. Ironwood is a native eastern Nebraska forest understory tree, but it's a tough as nails plant that will take full sun or heavy shade. Gives you good fall color, usually a multi-stem plant, sometimes called hop hornbeam because of these hops-like fruits on them. So it's actually kind of growing too aggressively in our southeast Nebraska woodlands, displacing some of our oaks. So there's no problem with this tree being tough. A really rare tree that we should think more about, not native to Nebraska, but it is over in Missouri. And this is the black gum, Nyssa sylvatica. It's a tree that would actually probably be found growing more on moist or consistently moist soils, but it'll do perfectly well on about any yard in the eastern half of Nebraska with just a little bit of care. It's not the most drought tolerant thing, but it is a spectacular and wonderful tree to about 30 feet tall with great fall color. If you want a big, bold tree to say, I'm here and I'm here for your community, that's the sycamore. The sycamore is a native Nebraska tree, primarily found on eastern Nebraska waterways along rivers and streams. So it's a riparian tree. But once established, boy, it's drought tolerant too. You can't beat that ghostly white bark in the winter. I love a sycamore. Here's my cohort, Bob Hendrickson, up on one of the boughs of the state champion sycamore south of Brownville. Ornamental trees, we don't have a lot of ornamental trees native to our region, but one of the best is black cherry. I mentioned to you the ornamental pear tree gets planted all over, and we need to quit planting it, but one good substitute would be the black cherry. It's actually a forest tree, kind of similar in concept to our native choke cherry, but just a much bigger tree. It'll get 30, 40, 50 feet tall in its life. It'll take a lot of shade. It has this stucco-like bark that's attractive in the winter, nice flowers in the spring, fruit set in midsummer that the birds love to pick off, and usually a good fall color. Let's plant more black cherry. I could spend all day talking about oak trees, and we don't want to keep you here all day, but just look at this list. Look at this list of Midwest Great Plains native oak trees that we can plant across much of Nebraska. Oaks get a little harder to grow the further west we go, but in the eastern half of Nebraska, all of these will work, and several of them will work even out west where I'm from in the Kimball area or Scotts Bluff. So think about regionally native oaks. If we could only plant one oak, I'd probably suggest the bur oak. It's the most prevalent Great Plains oak tree from Texas to Manitoba, Canada. It occurs out into Wyoming, up into the South Dakota Black Hills and western North Dakota. It's a wonderfully tough, long-lived, wide-spreading, shade-casting, benevolent, beautiful, wonderful tree. You cannot go wrong with planting a bur oak. If you could plant a bur oak and let it get some age on it, you've given to the future civilization, our kids and our grandkids, like you cannot believe. So plant a bur oak where you get a chance. A similar tree in terms of toughness would be chinkapin oak. It doesn't get nearly as massive as the bur oak, but it's native in southeast Nebraska. What's great about this tree is it's tolerant of our highly calcareous soils of western Nebraska. So it has a wide range of adaptability, and nobody ever plants it. People, let's plant the chinkapin oak. We've got our eye on a population of oaks in eastern Colorado and southeastern Colorado, as well as northern New Mexico. There's a hybrid complex of trees that or exist from the last ice age when they were mingling. There were species like bur oak, post oak, gamble oak, Rocky Mountain live oak, all mingling together. And when the ice ages retreated, they left these pockets of hybrid oaks everywhere. Some of them grow into nice trees. Some of them are more shrubby, but they will tolerate the heat and droughts like you cannot believe. And we don't plant any of these in our communities. So we're working hard to find seed strains to bring back to Nebraska for trialing. A great, great native tree for pollinators and just shade and beauty is our American linden. It'll be blooming in mid to late May, wonderfully fragrant, and you will not find a better tree for bees and pollinators. A tree that gets used in great numbers all across Nebraska is the hackberry. The problem is that we don't plant it anymore, and most of our big old hackberries are starting to age out in our communities, and we have to start growing more hackberry. It's one of the most tolerant trees that we can put out in the landscape, one of the best shaped trees for providing shade on the street and the front lawn. So more hackberry, please, more hackberry. And these seeds, Native Americans figured out that they were very good in the diet, and birds love them as well. Evergreens, quickly, I'll dive into evergreens. We do not have many natives to choose from. The most widespreading native evergreen in Nebraska, other than red cedar, is the ponderosa pine. And this is especially a no-brainer for western Nebraska, the western half of Nebraska. Look at these trees in Kimball. They are shade trees. Who said you can't plant a pine for shade tree? That's a wonderful shade tree out west, and we need to think about some of our pines as shade trees. They could be long-lived, 100 years or more. Look at the size of that tree out in Kimball, 70 feet tall, been there a long time. Wonderful, beautiful native evergreen. There's a cousin out there in far western Nebraska, the limber pine. These limber pines in far western Kimball County exist on dust and maybe a few spits of rain and snow every so often. 10 to 15 inches of moisture a year is all they generally get. And there's some of them that are 500 years old or older, believe it or not. And they've been planted in the Kimball City Park nearby. This is a woefully underused evergreen for especially western Nebraska. Evergreens are definitely a challenge with a changing climate. So we need to even cast a broader net in terms of regionality here. But here are some species I'd say that have stood the test of time in the right location in Nebraska. Concolor fir, Norway spruce, Swiss stone pine, southwestern white pine, the eastern white pine, and the Douglas fir. These all probably aren't the first crayon out of the box on a site that you're going to plant, but when you have a little protection, consistent moisture, especially in eastern Nebraska, a lot of these species are going to be just fine. This Swiss stone pine is really proving to be drought tolerant across the state. We could talk other evergreens, but these are the ones I'll leave with you as maybe the things we should be planting more of. And I'll say one more thing about that before we time out. The Colorado spruce, everybody loves it. It's a great Rocky Mountain species. It gets used a lot across Nebraska. My recommendation is to start going away from Colorado spruce. Our climate is just not going to sustain it going forward. That doesn't mean we have to quit planting it completely, but these would be good alternatives to Colorado spruce. Okay, and I'm going to fly through some regionally native shrubs. One thing I want you to think about is when we plant trees, if we could plant trees in groups with each other, but in groups with shrubs and other plants, the trees will actually have a better go of it in Nebraska. And if we would plant trees in groups in mass with shrubs, we'd create an island impact of much better landscape appeal and impact. So here are some shrubs to grow with our trees. Amelanchier alnifolia is our native serviceberry, the Saskatoon serviceberry. Wonderful fruit. Good luck beating the birds to that thing, but it's one of the best fruits you could ever eat. Plant a few of these with the tree you plant, and man, you're going to be feeding yourself, the robins, and everybody else on the block. It's wonderful. The black chokeberry, similar to that serviceberry, easy to grow. White spring flowers coming on soon here, and they're going to end up with a tasty black fruit midsummer, and then even good fall color. I love American hazelnut. Yes, it's native to eastern Nebraska, one of the easiest and best shrubs we can grow, and you're not going to find anything with that salmon colored fall color that beats the American hazelnut. Buttonbush loves a wet site, but it'll grow in droughty conditions as well. And that buttonbush is also just amazing in the pollinators it attracts late spring and early summer when those Sputnik flower balls are in blooming. The dwarf chinquapin oak from southeast Nebraska, tough as nails, and it starts producing acorns by its second year in life. It's crazy that way, and it can throw out thousands and thousands of acorns in a year. So great wildlife plant. The gray dogwood, easy to grow. It comes in shrubby forms that are 4 to 5 feet tall, and then tree forms that might reach 20 feet tall. The vernal witch hazel, this was blooming actually a couple months ago, very late winter, very early spring. I have no problem growing this tree or shrub in Waverly. Eastern Nebraska is good country for vernal witch hazel. The wild plum, yep, you see them all over the road ditches, but they get rogued out quite often by the road clearance crew and the farmers. We need to make room for our own wild native plums. They're fantastic. They're blooming right now in eastern Nebraska. And if you get anywhere where you scent the smell of grape Kool-Aid in the air, it's probably our wild plum right now. Sumacs can have a wonderful variety across the horticultural world, easy to grow. And here are a couple I'd really recommend to you: fragrant sumac, and then the skunk bush sumac, autumn amber. Those are both, autumn amber would be much better for western Nebraska, Grollo sumac for eastern Nebraska. These are good filler plants and do a lot to sustain birds and wildlife. These fruits that set in the late summer, those are good winter food for our wildlife. And actually we humans can make drinks and teas out of the fruits of the sumac. A sumac I've really come to love in Waverly, where I've planted it, is the shining sumac. It's got this shining foliage and absolutely fantastic fire red fall color. The clove currants are blooming right now. This is an eastern Nebraska native, and you'll get why they call it clove currant if you smell it, because it smells exactly like cloves. I can smell it across my backyard right now. I love this plant. Snowberries and coralberries are sometimes called buckbrush. They're not highly thought of by people traipsing through the forest. They're a tick magnet, and kind of get you gummed up if you're walking through the forest. But they are spectacular plants for wildlife. When they're blooming, they are fantastic for pollinators, and then they're actually a wonderful winter food plant for a lot of winter overing birds. Viburnums, we could talk all day about viburnums. One of the best as a very large shrub or a small tree is the blackhaw viburnum, with its great fall color, early spring flowers, and these fantastic purple-black fruits. The American cranberry bush viburnum, Viburnum trilobum, tough as nails, easy to grow, has a cranberry-like fruit set on it. You can see here on the right where it gets its name. I love this plant, woefully underused. The arrowwood viburnum actually would prefer a more consistently moist site, so don't throw it out in the toughest of droughts, but where you have a little extra moisture or maybe a spot that doesn't drain well, throw out some arrowwood viburnum. Look at the fall color on arrowwood viburnum. You're never disappointed. You probably see across our communities in eastern Nebraska the burning bush, which is a common non-native foundation shrub planted for its fall red color. And it's not necessarily a bad plant, but it is an invasive plant in eastern United States. I would suggest let's stop planting the burning bush and let's start planting its cousin, our own native eastern wahoo, or Nebraska burning bush, the Euonymus atropurpurea. It doesn't get quite as vividly red in the fall, but it is a lovely dusty red color. And then these popcorn-like fruit balls that hang off of it in the fall open up to these really blood red seeds that also give it a cool, attractive appeal in the late summer and fall. I'll throw a few out at you for Western Nebraska if anybody's tuning in from out west. One of the best plants that goes woefully overlooked out west is mountain mahogany. It grows natively across the Wildcat Hills south of Scotts Bluff and Gearing and down into the Pine Bluffs area of Kimball County. It's tough, tough, tough. It'll grow on dust and bird poop. It doesn't ask for anything in return. It'll be a 6 to 8 foot tall plant. And then it gets these wonderfully wispy seed heads late summer and into fall, these yellow flowers in the spring. I don't think you could kill it with drought if you tried. The rabbit brush. If you could grow a rabbit brush in eastern Nebraska, it would get sold by the millions, but it doesn't like it here. It likes that dusty, dry country and the more calcareous soil of western Nebraska, the higher pH. And then by late summer, when the blooms come on, it is loaded with bees and butterflies and buckeyes, the butterfly we see here, all kinds of cool butterflies. Creeping Mahonia is a semi-evergreen or evergreen shrub that hangs underneath the ponderosa pines in the Pine Ridge of western Nebraska. And we should plant this thing in the backdrop of our evergreen trees or underneath evergreens in western Nebraska in our yards. There's a cousin of it called the Oregon grape that we sometimes grow in eastern Nebraska, but this is a 2 to 3 foot holly-like evergreen that will do really well under our trees. Do you remember that ponderosa pine tree I showed you as a shade tree? Plant that, and then underneath it, plant 6 or 8 of these, and your neighbors will say, how the heck did you do that? You don't have to mow underneath those trees. They're fantastic. Sand cherry. Sand cherry, if you could eat the sand cherry, you're going to say, I don't need another cherry to eat. This is the best tart cherry to be eating. They're not long-lived, but the Prunus besseyi, the sand cherry from the sand hills into western Nebraska, is a great choice for central and western Nebraska. Great filler plant with fall color, not long-lived, but you'll love it for the 8 or 10 years that you have it, and then replant it again. Something to think about as I wrap up here. Small native shrubs are scarce. There's just no doubt about it. People want shrubs for foundation plantings, and that's why spireas and barberries and roses get planted. And those things aren't necessarily bad. But when we're looking for small shrubs in a native sense, we don't have many to choose from. So here's what I would suggest to you. Where you think you might need a shrub, you might just actually want or need a really wonderful native perennial prairie plant. And here are just some of them that you could use as shrub alternatives. Northwind switchgrass, little blue stem, aromatic aster, this dwarf blue indigo. I have plants in my landscape that are 20 years old now. That's a long-lived perennial. New Jersey tea, mountain mint on the lower left. And then another one I'm a real big fan of is the Amsonias, the threadleaf Amsonia here, or the blue star. They are also these wonderful mounded things that you can trim in midsummer to keep it 2 to 3 feet tall. And that's really where we should probably be thinking about our shrub layer going forward. One thought here as we get towards wrapping up, what not to plant. And like I mentioned to you, there's over 200 types of trees, probably equally a number of shrubs that we can grow in Nebraska. So maybe it's easier just to say what not to plant. And for me, it comes down to this concept. Don't plant anything that's invasive, that's a non-native invasive. You can go to the Nebraska Invasive Species Program. They've got all of these things listed out for you. And if they're a problem in Missouri or Kansas or Iowa or eastern Nebraska, South Dakota, don't plant them. And look at the list here. Ornamental pears, bush honeysuckles, multiflora rose, buckthorn, Russian olive, autumn olive, salt cedar. Here's a very common vine plant that gets planted, sweet autumn clematis. Winter creeper, another vine that used to be planted all over. We need to quit planting these things. There are better native species for everything you're thinking about here in terms of these plants. So I'll just leave it at that for now. Here's just one idea though. Instead of this ornamental pear tree, which I planted by Hamlow School here in Waverly a few years ago, maybe 20, 25 years ago. Now I say, hey, no more. We're going to plant shadblow serviceberry, a black cherry, or a Donald Wyman crabapple. There's better plants. That doesn't mean we can't use non-natives. There are many well-behaved non-natives. Some of them are really well adapted to our tough urban conditions that when we have soil health limitation. They're really important for streets and downtown areas for trees. And then there are many evergreens that we like to use that are non-native. So let's make room for the non-natives in the right spot that are not aggressive or invasive. And then I'll just wrap up by saying, once you've picked out that tree to plant and those shrubs to plant, let's make sure we've planted them properly. Start with good nursery stock, right? Number one, the big box store you're wanting to go buy your plants from. I shouldn't pick on Lowe's or Home Depot or Kmart, but you're going to get what you pay for there. So buy your plants from reputable Nebraska nurseries. They're selling the best stuff. Part of the most important thing you can think about when you're buying trees, especially, buy the root system. Yes, you need to buy a good looking top, but you can't see the root system. And we get sold a lot of junk in the box stores for our trees. So this is why you want to go to reputable nurseries who are producing very good root systems. Grow bags and special containers have been utilized to figure out how to grow better trees with roots that aren't circling. This can be the problem then when we use a tree stuffed into a plastic container and then forgotten on the back lot of the big box store. You end up with circling roots that can be problematic after they're planted. Not all containerized trees are bad. Here's a tree on the upper right that is actually going to be a very nice tree once we tease the roots out and get it off to a good start. And then here's a thought. Generally speaking, the smaller the transplant and the less time in the container, the more likely the root system will be better. So just be aware, generally the smaller the tree, the less time in the container, the better. Proper planting then, get it home. We got to make sure we've got it properly planted. The two most important things we have to think about are planting depth. Where are those first lateral roots? They need to be just under the soil surface. We often end up getting trees too deep in the landscape, and that smothers trees and it leads to a lot of death and decline. And then deal with circling problematic roots at planting time. You may need to cut some, you may need to spread them out. If it was grown in a container, you probably have to deal with the root system. And then timing is critical. Try to plant your trees in the spring and the fall when the weather is cool. I won't belabor this point at all, but good design and placement is important. Think about where the tree is going in the landscape. Is it wet or dry? Are you planting other trees with it? And like I mentioned earlier, plant trees in groups. They love to grow together. Here in windswept Nebraska, if you can plant 2 or 3 trees closer together, they'll grow up as one unit, help protect each other from the worst of our winds, share a rooting space with each other, and they'll be happier for it. I guarantee you, they'll grow faster and be healthier than when we scatter them about. Look how Mother Nature does it. This is how the trees grow in the forest. And obviously we can't do this in every park or backyard, but Mother Nature is really telling us this is how she wants to plant our trees. So we get into our parks, let's do this. Let's plant trees tight together with other shrubs and ground covers, separate them from the lawn so the lawnmower isn't mowing on them and you're not overwatering them. And I guarantee you, the trees are going to rock and roll for you. They're going to love it. They're going to say, get me out of the competition of that lawn. Let me share a rooting space so that I can partake in this concept of the wood wide web. That's this whole notion that underneath the ground, trees are talking to each other through these fungal mats of mycorrhiza and other fungi. And there's a lot of forest research coming on to show that if we're really careful about how we do this with our trees, their roots are going to interconnect, grow together in a mutually conducive way. So let's think about that as we deal with our landscapes and our communities. Obviously, in our backyard, we're not going to recreate a forest, but one thing we can do is add mulch. And this year, with as hot and as dry as it's likely going to be, mulch is probably one of the most important things you can do to help keep a tree sustained in a hot, dry summer. It'll help cool the ground. It'll help keep moisture in the ground, and it'll keep that lawnmower away from bumping the trunk. So final thoughts as we wrap up here. Use more regionally native species. Well-behaved non-natives are okay. Choose good nursery stock. Plant in groups separating from the lawn. Plant properly at the right time of the year, at the right depth and with root awareness. Mulch new trees and keep them watered. Learn how to properly prune young trees. That will have to be a whole separate topic. And then, oh my gosh, enjoy those trees and keep planting. Please keep planting, okay? We don't keep up anymore with our planting. I'm going to show you one more picture as I wrap up here. Let's go back to this. You see this picture on the right? President Herbert Hoover planting a tree at the White House on Arbor Day in 1931. I know I went over it real quickly, but proper tree planting. What do you see going on in the hole here? Somebody didn't know what they were doing back in 1931. This tree is way too deep into the ground. The first lateral roots are way below the soil surface, and we don't even know where the first lateral roots are. We can see that trunk is like a telephone pole. So the roots, the first lateral roots are probably another foot deeper into that soil ball. So it's just interesting. Don't tell the President Hoover I said this, but they were doing that wrong back in 1931. So, but they meant well, right? Okay, everybody, that's all I had. Thank you for your time. If we have any questions, we can ask, take a few questions, but otherwise, yeah, thank you, everybody. I really appreciated the opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We have one question from Peggy. She asked, where can we purchase pecan trees, hazelnut shrubs, or the wahoo shrub you mentioned? Any specific nurseries in the area?
Yes, right. I don't want to be a mouthpiece for any specific nursery, but yes, there is a nursery up in called Great Plains Nursery up northwest of Lincoln near Valparaiso and Weston, Nebraska. And they they specialize in regionally native plants or trees collected from our own landscapes. And they grow a lot of both pecan and the wahoo and other things. So that would be a good place to start. And then Challenger, you can go, like in Lincoln, go to Campbell's and ask. They'll probably find it for you. In Omaha, go to Mall Halls or Lanahaw and ask. But definitely work with your local nurseries to find this stuff. There's a nursery in Southwest Nebraska, owned Common Sense Nursery. I know they work really hard to find things. So, oh, and I should have mentioned, the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum sells trees and shrubs. It helps sustain the organization. All of those plants I've mentioned come through the inventory of the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum. Their plant sales are going on right now with Spring Affair this weekend. And then next weekend, there's going to be a plant sale on the East Campus of the university. So yeah, good question.
Oh, before we go on, Grace, if you could put up the end of presentation questionnaire. This is just something we would like you to fill out so that we can improve our future stuff. Or you got something else to say, Grace?
Yeah, it's just a feedback survey for us and just to see what topics you guys are interested in if you like this event. Yeah, it's just short 3 questions. So I'll launch that right now for you guys.
All right. Moving on with some more questions though. We had a comment that said the limbs of the nysa looked really wiggly.
Yeah.
And then any comment, anything more on that?
Yeah, that's probably Emily Levine. She knows her trees for sure. She helps manage the East Campus Arboretum, Nero Maxwell Arboretum. She knows more about trees than about anybody out there. I agree with you, Emily, that's one of the wonderful things about a black gum. Well, I don't know how they do that wavy pattern, but that's pretty distinctive.
And I think it was regarding the first post she said, but she asked, do you know if there's a future of that species?
The future of which species?
I think she
Nyssa?
meant the Nyssa. Oh, Emily, if you want to,
Oh, yeah, right, Emily, right. Yep, definitely a natural feature of that plant. The few I've planted around, I watch them do that too. It just must be the way, the bud sets, it goes down and then it twists up and then it's down and pretty soon it's doing that waviness.
I have a question. Do you know what some of the most common mistakes are when people are first planting their shrubs and their trees?
Yeah, a couple that come to mind is scattering them too far apart. If you have a lot of room to work with, people want to put trees maybe 50 feet apart. You don't have to. I'd put them closer. You could put shrubs with trees, let the tree be an anchor for the shrub. Another thing people do is maybe they put their evergreen tree too close to the front door or the window out of their living room, because that spruce is going to eat the front of your house. Things like that, probably.
We got a question. What shrub, if any, is okay to do or do okay in compacted soil?
What shrubs for compacted soil? All of those shrubs I mentioned to you, I've been impressed at their adaptability. So some of our toughest shrubs, things like sumac, roughleaf dogwood, coralberry, snowberry. I love the snowberry. There's actually quite a few plants that are really going to do fine in compacted clay soil. You'd be surprised. And the cool thing about planting these shrubs, if you plant a few together, they're going to bust up your clay soil. Throw a little mulch on them and you'd be surprised how loose that soil gets over time. So don't be afraid to plant into clay soil. But yeah, you do want tougher shrubs in heavy clay.
I don't see any more questions coming in. So just another reminder, this will be posted on our YouTube channel for future viewings. And do you have any contact information that you'd like to give out?
Yes, right. Anybody can contact me anytime. I should have left my last screen up. I'll do that here just so that as we're signing off, people can see. Okay, there's my contact information, jevertson1@unl.edu. I have a phone number, 472-6604, 402-472-6604. And we do love to talk to people about trees and landscapes. So don't hesitate to send a message, question.
That's awesome. If you wanted to contact Conservation Nebraska, any other events or anything else, you can contact us on Facebook or you can go to our website, conservationnebraska.org. And there's multiple ways you can get in contact with us there. So, and Grace just put her personal, her work email in the chat if you guys want to copy that down. Thank you, Grace. Oh, and that's mine too. Thanks, Grace.
Yeah, that's what I should have done. Huh? I'm not.
She's on top of it. Thank you.
Got you guys. Yeah, well, thank you everyone for coming, and thanks Madison for setting us up, and thank you Justin. And let me just copy
yeah, if you can go on YouTube, just type in Conservation Nebraska, will pop up. It should be there in a couple weeks, just depending on how long it takes us to edit this.
All right. It'll probably be trending that day.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. All right, thank you guys.
Thanks so much for showing up.
Goodbye.
Bye.